Money and Macro fact-checking Gary Stevenson from Gary's Economics. I'm sure all of my viewers are going to agree with him and will give him total credence if he has anything to say against Gary Stevenson, because they are rationally, totally, realistically attached to his policies and not at all emotionally biased to agree with him because he's a cult leader that is giving you the black pill doomerism that you love and giving you a solution that is not actually a solution. Let's see.
Rising YouTube star Gary Stevenson from Gary's Economics has recently made huge waves with his message that average people in countries like the UK will
collapse into poverty. Desperate poverty. I'm talking about Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist. That is the future of this country if we don't deal with growing inequality.
Gary's main message is that inequality can explain essentially everything, ranging from
the weak recovery from 2008, the cost of living crisis during COVID, stock price rally in the mid-2010s,
to
the rise of the far right. And if we don't take action on it, it will get worse and worse and worse and worse.
Luckily, Gary says that
inequality is the core central problem. I would encourage people to care about it, because if we don't take action on it, it means living standards getting worse and worse and worse.
But
okay, I obviously disagree. This is about a fact check. Don't say anything yet, but I have to say, yeah, I don't agree. The inequality is a symptom. It's a symptom of the fact that you've got a welfare state that cannot pay for itself, and it can't pay for itself because of, horrible government policies. And the terrible government policies are also just as reasonable and, in fact, much more correctly line up with the problems that he just says, the weak recovery and, the stock price rally and the cost of living crisis. All of these things can be mapped onto direct government decisions. And I mean, which ones do you think is more powerful in the US? Do you think it's rich people, or do you think it's the government? The government controls what rich people do. I mean, if not, then why? Yeah, like if the rich people are actually in charge in the UK, then the idea of the government taxing them is just like categorically impossible. Because if rich people don't want to be taxed, they just won't be taxed. Right? So then why would you be advocating for a policy that is qualitatively impossible?
is he actually correct? Can you trust Gary's Economics to tell you the truth? According to Gary, academic economists like me, well, we are part of the problem because
we've created a system which obviously takes all the good economists and said, we are going to fill your mouth with money if you shut the fuck up.
Yeah, well, Gary, this economist just so happens to do a series where I fact-check famous YouTubers talking about economics using data and academic research.
He stole my heart.
And a lot of my viewers asked me to feature your channel today, so here we are. In this series, I try to stick to the main message only, which for Gary starts with the UK's inequality crisis. Or in Gary's words, the UK is in an inequality crisis because
inequality is increasing. Inequality is increasing rapidly.
And
in this country we're talking right now, 150 years ago, ordinary men and women lived in desperate poverty, okay? That's going to happen again.
Because
there's a worryingly accelerating nature to inequality, which is the bigger inequality is, the higher the amount of transfer payments made from the poor to the rich, which means the higher the rate at which the rich dispossess the poor, which means the higher the rate of transfer payments. So this is, and probably the thing which sort of caught me the most and worried me the most about this, mathematically this is not self-containing.
To fact check these statements, I first searched for evidence that Gary uses himself to back them up. But strangely enough, in his own videos, Gary hardly ever uses any concrete evidence or data.
Yeah, he does not really like the numbers and data, which is also why I find that anytime people ask him to give real specific policy projections or like, hey, what would you do? He gets like pissed. He gets mad. He gets really incensed that you would ask him for actual solutions. Why? Why are you so mad? Why are you so mad and upset that people are asking you? You're saying the world is ending, okay? And you're saying, here's how we solve it. Okay, can we get any of that in like things that we could actually do? Because if the world is ending, we want to make sure that doesn't happen. And we'll move heaven and earth to make sure it happens. You got to give us a little bit of a plan, though. You got to give us something. You can't say, oh, hey, yeah, all right, there's an asteroid falling from the sky. We have to blow it up. Okay, I got it. How? Well, I mean, I'm not going to do that. Come on. Trying to tell me how to, we have to blow it up. All right. That's my contribution. I'm just trying to raise awareness to make sure that you know that this deadly asteroid is hurtling towards us, and the only solution is the one that I'm proposing. But I'm not going to propose an actual like enumerated plan to carry out that proposal. I'm just saying that's what's going to happen. You guys deal with it now. I'm going to keep telling everybody to freak out because there's the deadly asteroid coming. And then my proposal is the one that you need to use to solve it.
Yeah, this is no accident.
No,
Recently on the Despolaritza podcast, Gary said that it's because
I know the graphs are all bullshit.
Oh, shit.
From Fairness Foundation and from Equality.
Listen, all of the graphs are bullshit.
Now, for context, in this discussion, the podcast host essentially says, look, most data about inequality is actually produced by non-profits, such as the Fairness Foundation, that are explicitly fighting inequality. So you should be able to trust them, right? But when pressed a bit more, Gary said that the reason why he believes the graphs are still bullshit is that
We cannot accurately measure the wealth of the very rich. It's very, very difficult. You know, we have economists doing that. If you want, there's an economist, French guy, Gary Stevenson. He's really good.
And yeah, there's actually some truth to that. It's well known that the super rich hide a lot of their wealth, especially in tax havens. But actually, based on new tax haven data, Gabriel Zucman, Gary's favorite economist, has estimated that this only accounts for about 2 to 3% of total UK household wealth.
Damn.
Because it is really only the top 1% that can afford to use tax haven services.
Sure.
So yes, wealth inequality data misses some wealth for sure, but it's actually not that much. At least not for the UK. If we were studying Russia, where much more wealth is hidden offshore, then yes, Gary would have a good point. We cannot trust the data.
Okay. All wealth, including offshore, all wealth, excluding offshore wealth. And this is the percentage of total household wealth. And that's the percentage of it. So yeah, that is a small bit.
Data. But for the UK and other democracies, the data is probably pretty accurate. So to fact check Gary's claims about inequality, I relied on the database that Gabriel Zucman tends to use himself, the World Inequality Database. The economists that have made this database explicitly designed it to find hidden wealth by combining a lot of different data sources, such as tax data, private estimates, and so forth. As we can see here, Gary is right that UK wealth and income inequality have come down since the days of Charles Dickens.
All right, so the green line is wealth, and the red line is income. If you're red-green colorblind, the red is the top, or the orange, and the green line is the bottom one. The green line is trending somewhat downwards, but is much flatter. Income, it has a much steeper slope of drop-off. And this is the share of top 10%.
We can also see that inequality is now trending up again. The top 10% of British households now own more than 50% of total wealth. That's a lot. Meanwhile, they earn about over 30% of its income. So yes, Gary is right about the trend going back up. But does this trend look anything like a...
We'll collapse into poverty. Desperate poverty. I'm talking about Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist. That is the future of this country if we don't deal with growing inequality.
No, it does not. In fact, if we compare top 10% wealth across the world, we can see that Britain is colored yellow, meaning it is actually one of the most equal countries in the world.
Yep, we're aware.
Interestingly, if we look at income inequality, we can see Britain is dark yellow, meaning it's doing slightly worse. Still, as we can see, Britain is one of the more equal nations on earth. But hold on, Yuri, you sneaky economist.
You sneaky.
Gary is very clear on this channel. He does not talk about working millionaires.
Right, here we go. This is important. Come on, he's not talking about this.
He talks about billionaires, the top 1% or even 0.1%. What have they been up to? Well, as you can see here, Britain's 1% wealthiest own about 21% of its wealth. That's slightly higher than it was at its lowest point ever, but actually...
Oh, damn. All right. So at its lowest point, well, that's going only back to, let's say, 1975. Might have been, there might be further data on this. And obviously he's going to say, Gary's economics is going to say, well, come on, that's not true. Like in the 1950s and 60s, I mean, obviously he's not going to use graphs and these types of things because they're all bullshit. But if they supported him, I'm sure he would, but they won't, so he won't. If they were back in like the 1950s and 60s where there was like a 90% tax rate for these guys, then, you know, they wouldn't have had as much.
Actually comparable to the 21% they had in 1980. We can also see here that compared to South Africa, the US, and even the world average, Britain is relatively quite equal. And strikingly, the claim that
There's a worryingly accelerating nature to inequality.
does not appear to be true at all. So when it comes to fact-checking Gary, he's not off to a great start. Yes, inequality has been trending up for the last decade. That is worrying for sure. No doubt about that. But these graphs don't really fit with Gary's message of a
Will collapse into poverty. Desperate poverty. I'm talking about Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist. That is the future of this country if we don't deal with growing inequality.
Could it be that when Gary says that
I know the graphs are all bullshit.
because they are far less dramatic than Gary's message? I'm not sure. Let's give
I mean, he's saying it because he knows he can get more views if he's very hyperbolic. He's a good YouTuber. He's a good YouTuber. You say something, the claim is crazy. You make, you know, a thumbnail that says, you're going to die if you don't watch this video. And it's like, oh man, you're going to die if you don't watch this video because, you know, did you know that like if you don't get enough salt in your diet, you're 2.1% more likely to die of a heart attack 75 years into the future? You're going to die if you didn't know that. It's not clickbait. It's just slightly hyperbolic. He's a good YouTuber.
giving the benefit of the doubt for now, because there's actually some compelling evidence to support Gary's other claims.
All right, let me hear it.
Before
Lay it on
diving
me.
in, I first want to address a common criticism people comment under videos critical of Mr. Gary.
Okay, let's hear it.
You criticize Gary. Are you funded by the rich?
Oh.
Macro is an educational channel that is funded by our patrons, YouTube advertisements, and video sponsors, such as in this case, the
Sorry, buddy. I can't do it. Can't do it. I am not funded by these rich.
all the time to services that often get hacked to leak this information. So if you are like us and it drives everything.
There we go.
Concretely, Gary seems to believe that
So I think this makes sense, right? If you take the consumption power away from ordinary people who spend, you give it to rich people who save, wages will fall,
therefore
making a lot of money, but that inequality would devastate living standards and keep interest rates low and push house prices up and push stock
Are interest rates low?
prices up.
and therefore when it comes to the housing crisis, Gary says
The housing crisis is not a housing crisis. The housing crisis is a crisis of asset affordability. All asset prices have gone up enormously, and that means you can't afford them.
and
You're not going to deal with that by building more houses. You need to deal with that by stopping the inequality growth.
Okay, that seems like basic year one freshman macroeconomics shit. Okay, if the supply of houses go up, the price will go down. So if you built more houses, the affordability of them would be greater because the prices would be less because there would be a greater supply. There's the same amount of demand. That's like basic economic stuff. How did you screw that up? How did you mess that up, Gary? Come on.
Is that all true? Sadly, just as with his inequality explosion claims, Gary hardly ever backs up any of his claims with evidence, in his own videos at least. That is a real shame, because when I started looking into it, I could find a lot of research that backs up many of his claims. For example, there are some really good studies by economists from the IMF and World Bank which present evidence that rising inequality makes economies grow more slowly because rich people spend less than poor people. Second, I found some really interesting studies that present evidence increasing wealth inequality can cause asset bubbles because rich people buy more stocks. Third, I found a study which finds evidence that
But he wasn't talking about assets like stocks. He's talking about houses specifically. But okay.
increased inequality may indeed have driven down interest rates in the US, as rich people tended to invest a lot more in government bonds. Fourth, I found a lot of studies that confirmed that increased inequality together with cultural factors can help explain the rise of the far right in, for example, Nazi Germany and the USA today. On top of that, economists have found that rising inequality can be linked to more crime, worse health, and
yeah, the crime issue is the one that I would say has the best evidence for it in terms of relative inequality having societal effects. That is really the only thing that I can see that has like real legitimate credence in terms of people saying inequality is bad. That's the only thing I can see. In terms of like just the general idea of inequality is bad, I don't buy it, other than that one exception. In the sense that, people are unequal. There's no getting around that. There is an unequal distribution of talent, of skill, of eyesight, of strength. All of these things are unequal because we're human beings, okay? In certain scenarios, that inequality will lead to one group succeeding more and another failing more. But in another scenario, that group that was successful is now the failure, and that group that was the failure is now the success. We have a range of these talents and skills and these types of things because they apply to different scenarios. They apply to different environments. And we need them all because the environment is so complicated and different that we have to basically, as a species, if we're going to survive, or as a community or a society, we have to have stuff that covers all the bases all the time. And that means that if you're in a society that has good social mobility, like the US does, you are going to very easily have, generations where these people can explode in wealth and get incredibly successful and great, and then others where those same exact people will plummet back into poverty. That's kind of the norm in terms of humanity. It's also very clearly the case if you're looking at the numbers. A lot of the people in the UK that are rich now, they didn't inherit their wealth. They made it themselves.
and that it may make it very much more difficult for smart people from a poor background, like perhaps Gary himself, to make something of themselves. Inequality research even helped economists like Angus Deaton and Darren Acemoglu to win Nobel Prizes for their work. So no, Gary, economists don't ignore inequality. That being said, I do understand where Gary is coming from somewhat when it comes to talking about inequality in undergraduate economics classes. Much can be improved. While some recent textbooks discuss inequality at length, older popular economics textbooks don't talk about it at all. But besides education just being a bit slow to adapt,
I also say I don't think the undergraduate, that early level stuff, teaching you about the principles of economics, talking about inequality as a good or bad thing is not necessarily the province of economics. If I'm going to be totally honest, I understand why you might touch it later on in like grad school or something like that. But in general, it's more of a problem for like sociology or psychology to deal with, which is why the studies that say inequality leads to like higher crime and these types of things, they have come out of psychology journals.
There's also the reason that while there is evidence inequality has a role in driving almost everything, it is probably not the only thing that is significantly driving our economies, as Gary seems to think. For example, well, Gary's theory predicts that higher inequality would lead to lower interest rates and high government debt. If we look globally, we can clearly see that this is not the whole story. For example, more unequal countries like South Africa and Brazil tend to have higher interest rates than more equal countries like, for example, Japan and Denmark. But if we look at government debt, we can see that a relatively equal country like Denmark has very little, while an equal country like Japan has a lot, while very unequal countries like South Africa and Brazil are somewhere in the middle. And then when it comes to housing, Gary may be...
So it seems like it's not the driving factor.
Doing himself actually a disservice by not talking about the data. Gary seems to think that the rich are buying up all the houses as an investment, which is driving up house prices. Rich people can only live in 1 or 2 houses. What are they going to do with all of these investments? Either they would rent them out, driving down rent prices, or you would have a lot of empty homes sitting there doing nothing, like you had in the US housing bubble in 2006, or like you have in China today.
Right.
If we look at the data, we can see rents are not going down. But as you can see here, there are actually a lot of truly empty homes in the UK. About 7% of homes in Wales are empty, which is depopulating, and that's likely not really rich people's fault. But London also has a lot of empty homes. Particularly if we zoom in on central London, we can see that about 20% of homes in Kensington and Westminster are empty. That is clearly the ultra-wealthy hoarding property.
Yeah.
So here, I would say Gary's story is a mixed bag. He is right to point...
That is true. I will also say that you see a lot of the same stuff in like New York City. It's not necessarily the case though, and in fact, I think probably for London too, the people that are hoarding these houses, these assets and these things are generally not UK citizens. They're usually like foreign investors. They're from like China and stuff. Those are the people who are buying up those properties and then are holding them as investments. It tends to not be people that are actually living there. So the idea that you would then tax those people for that, they're not UK citizens, so you're not gonna be able to get them on everything. But I mean, yeah, you know, if you don't have any kind of a tax on property stuff, I don't know what the property tax is in the UK in terms of, you know, holding on to, you know, do you pay a 2% tax on the value of your property every year? I don't know if you do. I'm kind of like, like I say, I'm okay with that. That's something I'm willing to discuss.
To inequality being important, especially in the London housing crisis. But his various theories about how inequality is the biggest driver of just about everything, ranging from interest rates to government debt, that just does not appear to be true.
No.
So then, what about the issue that Gary campaigns for all the time? A wealth tax.
Now we're talking about the stuff that I care about. I'm so super against this. I think it's incredibly stupid, especially with the fact that he doesn't give any specifics, and the specifics matter in these things a lot. Like, okay, like, what are you talking about? A wealth tax, do you have anything about like a capital gains tax? Is that what would be in here? Because that kind of a tax, especially for the UK, would just be like not only disastrous from the sense of it would destroy the value of all these assets and these types of things, and it would drive people out. It would also be incredibly foolish to think that having that wealth tax is going to fix the economic situation by simply raising a little bit more revenue for your, you know, enormous amounts of public spending. It's like, yeah, okay, you're going to have another couple months of money that you can borrow to pay for the interest payments on your huge giant welfare state.
You see, given Gary's theory that wealth inequality is causing almost all of the UK's economic problems, it makes sense that he believes that.
So I think it's really important to recognize that these two things are.
But as we've seen, wealth inequality did not explode, and that while increased inequality is bad for the economy, it cannot explain all of the UK's problems, such as high government debt. What does this mean for Gary's wealth tax idea? Well, I found essentially two big problems with it. The first problem is that overall wealth compared to income is actually relatively low. For example, in the UK, total billionaire wealth was estimated to be around 108.
Billionaire wealth surges 3 times faster in 2024. World now on track for at least 5 trillionaires within a decade is the name of this article.
£2 billion in 2024. That's a lot of money, absolutely. Taxing a bit more of that could help the UK government do many things. But just for comparison, the UK government borrows almost £150 billion each year. So Gary's 2% wealth tax proposal, that's pennies. If you'd set an 83 wealth tax proposal for UK billionaires, you'd only be able to cover government borrowing for a single year. The second problem with Gary's optimistic wealth tax solution is the same that I've said in my previous video reacting to Gary. Ultra-rich people are very mobile. Yes, we are not sure how many millionaires left the UK after taxes rose recently, but there are various reports that quite a few rich people left Norway to flee its wealth tax, and when France still had a wealth tax, many wealthy French people famously moved to London. Similarly, many people are now moving from the UK to Milan after it introduced a very low tax for very wealthy people.
Now, I will say that I think Gary does not care. I don't see him ever mentioning, maybe he doesn't, maybe he cares, but it's not his main point, is that the fact is when you tax wealthy people, the thing that you're doing is you're raising government revenue. I find that Gary's argument for the wealth being hoarded by the super wealthy drives working class or middle class people out of the market of, gaining wealth in terms of, being able to buy assets. It increases the price of them. They can't afford them. And therefore they can't get, houses. They can't get things that, increase their wealth holdings. I understand that. However, I've yet to understand how it is possible that the government taxing that wealth, even just straight up, like let's say they commandeer the wealth of all of the, the top 1%, 0.1%, whatever. They just take it. How does that put it in the hands of working class, middle class people? It doesn't. It puts it in the hands of the government. And then the government has to do something with it. Now, what's the government going to do with it? They're going to start more government programs? They've already got a ton of government programs in the UK that are, designed to redistribute wealth from rich people to poor people. And if that's not working now, why would you think getting a little bit more would alleviate that problem? It doesn't seem like it would to me.
Almost all super wealthy F1 drivers live in Monaco, which is a tax haven. Overall, there is a lot of evidence that many rich people successfully dodge high taxes by moving to another country. Gary has always reacted to this argument by saying that
taxing the rich will be very, very difficult. It's possible. These people are not magicians. These people are not Gandalf. They can't magic themselves out of the country and disappear all of the wealth out of the country. The wealth is here. It is the wealth of our countries.
In other words, while billionaires can move, they cannot move all their wealth. The wealth remains in Britain. When it comes to property, this certainly applies. In fact, after seeing how many homes are empty in London, I think Gary could make a really convincing case that Britain needs a wealth tax on property, rather than its current council and stamp duty taxes.
Okay, so it is just a flat tax on that stuff? So you could, a property tax, like I said, I'm willing to discuss that.
This could be great for the British economy, as it may allow more nurses and teachers to live in central London if the ultra-rich start renting it out to pay for this wealth tax. However, most assets that the ultra-rich have are not property. When a wealth tax was discussed for the US many years ago, economists were quick to point out that about 80% of the assets of the ultra-wealthy are financial assets, such as government bonds or bank deposits that can be easily moved elsewhere. They can do this because countries like the UK have free capital flows. Similarly, when Norway introduced a wealth tax, many of its entrepreneurs fled to Switzerland. Thanks to free trade agreements, countries cannot tax imports, so this wealth is not tied to the country either. Norwegian entrepreneurs can just take their company headquarters with them and then export to Norway. These problems could explain why Gary recently talked about wealth tax complexity in the following terms.
This, I think, really encapsulates the childish naivety that I talk about. Is people turn around to me and they say, okay, all right, show me the tax policy then. Show me the tax policy. You know.
Yeah, I mean, we reacted to this video. He got pissed. He got really upset that people were asking for some kind of actual answers. I'm like, okay, you're freaking me out nonstop. All you're talking about is how the world is on a crash course to total collapse. This is the solution, but you're not giving me any specifics on the solutions? And he's
Listen,
pissed.
I'm here in my kitchen, right, which is real, with a massive YouTube channel. I'm pretty obviously the world's biggest campaigner for wealth taxes, and I work hard, right? Do you think tax policies are usually made by YouTubers?
Yeah, Gary is of course right. Tax systems are designed by economists, and then they are implemented by politicians and lawyers, many of them, who then often water them down, leaving in tiny loopholes. On the bright side, if we look at the data, we can see that taxes do already decrease inequality. For example, as you can see here, income inequality in the UK before taxes is almost as bad as it is in the US. But after taxes, it is much better. Despite that, yeah, I agree with Gary that the current tax system is not fair. New research by US economist Zuckman shows that US billionaires only pay an average tax rate of about 24%. That's much lower than what the middle class would pay. Totally unfair. A fairly recent study in the UK found that if high-income earners paid headline rates, they would have to pay 23 billion more than they currently do. That's a lot of money, no doubt about it. But a solution to fix the entire UK economy? No. Sorry, that's just 2% of total government income today. So where does that leave Gary? In other words, can you trust Gary's economics? To me, it's a mixed bag. Gary is right that rising inequality is a big problem. Gary is fighting for a fairer tax system, which is needed. Yet there is so much good research about how bad inequality is and why it's bad, and Gary doesn't use it. He rather relies on his own theories.
Right.
There's so many proposals about how...
Which to me does feel like he's just not basing any of this stuff on facts. If you've got the facts to support your stuff, use the facts. If you're not going to use them to support your stuff and you've got them, I would imagine it's just simply because you don't actually care about what the facts are. You're just caring about what the feelings are, what the vibe is. This feels right. This feels good. I'm getting a reaction from it, and it's getting me views. So why would I bother? Why would I waste my time looking up facts and figures? This money and macro guy, I'm pretty sure he's been around longer than Gary's economics. He's not even half the size. So clearly, Gary is aware of how to be a good YouTuber, and graphs and all that kind of stuff is boring. It's numbers. It's not for people that are, bright like me and just know that this is the case. And I can just say it and I can just, spout off about it. Yeah. And people get pumped up about it. Clearly. Yeah. He's a good YouTuber.
How to reform the tax system, but Gary doesn't appear to have read them carefully. Instead, he makes a lot of exaggerated statements like how Britain will collapse because of skyrocketing inequality, which is clearly not true. That is a shame, because to get a fairer tax system, Gary has said that...
I think in particular, we need what I'm thinking of as academic cover, which is economists, people at think tanks, people with these kind of academic credentials.
And to get that, I think he needs to be be a little bit less hyperbolic with his messaging and be a bit more evidence-based. This is of course easier said than done, because so far Gary has built a massive following precisely with very hyperbolic collapse messages that tap into very legitimate problems like the massive housing and cost of living crisis in the UK. He boasts about how great his predictions are about rising asset prices and falling living standards, and I checked this and yeah, so far they've not been perfect but pretty good. To be a successful trader like Gary clearly was, that's all you need to be right more often than wrong about financial assets. This is how you make money. But to convince researchers your theory should not only predict the future a couple of times, your theory should also be able to explain why inequality is not increasing so fast anymore. Why super unequal countries actually have relatively high interest rates, and why some very equal countries have very high government debt. If Gary can improve his theories to line up with all the evidence, such as how research has shown that ignoring inequality leads to a worse economy, more crime, worse health, and the rise of the far right, then I think Gary can succeed to make his case with people with, as he says it, academic credentials. Heck, Gary, if you are watching, feel free to check out my sources in the description below and use them as you please. By the way, I did reach out to Gary's team multiple times to comment on this video, but so far he has not responded. So if you are a Gary fan, please ask him to come on my podcast. I'd love to have him. Money Macro Talks is the name, and we could then together go through the arguments presented in this video. But yeah, what do you think?
What do I think? Do I think he's going to come on that podcast? I don't think so. I don't think so. Doesn't seem like it would be a good deal for him. Maybe he will. I hope he proves me wrong. That would be a cool podcast to watch. What do you think? Was I too nasty to Gary's economics? I probably was. I was probably a little bit too mean. But you know what? I'm taking after him. I'm being very hyperbolic. I'm being very flim-flammery. I'm being very much of just a crazy bombastic personality and saying that this person's the worst ever. All right. Gary Stevenson is going to eat your kids if he's not allowed to fix your economy. He's going to do it. Yeah. Now that's basically like a quote from him. Yeah, that was a quote. 'Cause what did he say? Oh yeah, he said, Jeff Bezos is going to eat your kids. I'm sure he was, just being very accurate and evidence-based and truthful when he said that, and he was not being hyperbolic in any way, shape, or form. Good luck in all your endeavors. Thank you much for your time and attention. Farewell for now.